Hello, dear listener, and welcome. Tonight I invite you to slow down with me, to slip quietly through a veil of time and wander softly into a world both forgotten and feared. A world hidden deep beneath the velvet shadows of stone cathedrals, beneath flickering candlelight and echoing prayers, a place where men whispered in Latin and justice wore the mask of fire and steel. The tale we share tonight is not one of kings or glory, but of inquisitors. Those quiet figures who moved like ghosts through medieval Europe. They held the power to accuse, to question, to judge, and often to destroy. Their life was not golden, not noble, not easy. It was brutal, haunting, and strangely devout. So rest easy now. Let the hush of the past surround you. Let your breathing slow, your thoughts drift like smoke, and your imagination open its eyes. Come, make yourself comfortable. Perhaps pull the blanket a little closer and let your mind lean gently into this tale. Our journey begins in a monastery in the cold stillness of a 13th century dawn. The air was always cold before sunrise. Brother Matteo pulled the wool of his habit tighter across his chest as he stepped from the dormitory hall, his sandals scuffing softly on the stone. He was young for an inquisitor, only 29, but his eyes had aged far beyond the rest of him. They held shadows in their corners, as though they were used to seeing what others could not or would not. The monastery at Narbonne stood on a lonely hilltop. Its spires reached toward a sky still heavy with night, while the countryside below slept in breathless silence. The monks here rarely spoke. They prayed, they copied texts, sometimes when summoned they recorded confessions. That was all. Matteo had been sent here for one purpose, to begin. He stood now in the apothecary's alcove, lighting a taper. The flame flickered against the glass vials and parchment rolls, casting everything into an amber glow. He stared at a scroll for a long moment, not reading it, but remembering what it meant. Heretici non sunt tolerandi. Heretics are not to be tolerated. It was not an angry phrase. It was quiet, final, like a closing door. Matteo did not see himself as cruel. He had once been a boy with freckles, who had sung with the other novices under the rose window of the cathedral at Carcassonne. He had read the gospel with tears in his eyes. He had fasted, he had studied, he had served. But the Cathars had come. They had turned the simple faith of the people inside out. Gentle heresies whispered in fields and homes. No need for priests, no need for sacraments. The church was not the way. Jesus was not divine. So the Inquisition was born. Not out of hatred, the elders had said, but out of sorrow. A shepherd who loves his flock cannot let it stray. Better to wound a few than to lose them all. And so men like Matteo were sent to search, to uncover, to confess, and, if necessary, to burn. This was his first assignment, and the morning of it had finally arrived. A knock came, quiet, deliberate. He turned. It was Brother Anselm, older, with parchment skin and hands folded in his sleeves. "She is waiting," Anselm whispered, no judgment in his tone, only a strange, distant patience. Matteo followed him down a hallway that twisted like a maze of shadows. The room they entered had thick walls and no windows. At its centre sat a woman, no older than 40, wrapped in plain linen. Her hands were bound gently, not tightly, as though she might forget herself and fly away. Her name was Esclarmonde. She was Cathar, or at least she had once listened to Cathars speak, perhaps even fed one. No one was ever quite sure. But the bishop had written the order and the Inquisition had come. Matteo sat across from her, his cloak brushing the rush-covered floor. He took a moment before speaking. His voice, when it came, was softer than the wind outside. "Sister," he said, "do you know why you have been brought here?" Her eyes were steady, not proud, not afraid, just certain. She said nothing. He waited. Silence was a form of speech here. "I do not wish harm to you," Matteo said. "Only understanding, Blake. You are loved by God, and he is grieved." Still, she did not answer. Matteo unfolded the parchment before him. It was not an accusation, not yet, only a record. He would ask, she would answer, and the record would grow. "Have you been baptized in the church?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Her voice was dry as dust. "Do you believe Christ is the Son of God, fully divine?" She paused. Then slowly, "I believe he was sent to teach, to love." Matteo's pen did not stop, but his eyes flickered. That answer was not enough. Outside, the monastery bell tolled, once, twice, and then silence again. The session would not last long. Inquisitors never rushed. They asked one question, then another, then waited. A day, a week, a month. until the soul unfolded or broke. Esclarmonde did not break, but she did weep. And that, in some strange way, mattered more than a confession. That night, Matteo knelt in the chapel alone while the cold pressed in through the stones. He prayed not for her, but for himself, for the burden of carrying judgment like a flame in trembling hands. In the days that followed, more were brought to the monastery. Old women, farmers, widowers, children, each with rumours clinging to them like fog. A whispered prayer that skipped mass, a loaf of bread given to the wrong traveller, a hymn sung in the wrong language. Matteo listened, he questioned, he recorded. Some confessed freely, weeping, begging for forgiveness. Others denied everything. Still others spoke in riddles, in songs, in silence, and each night he would return to the chapel and weep. The Inquisitor's life was not one of triumph. It was not one of hatred either. It was, above all, a slow undoing of oneself in the service of something far, far greater, a quiet death of the spirit, a sacrifice of certainty. But this is only the beginning. Let us rest now. And when you are ready, we shall continue our slow descent into the corridors of faith, fear, and fire. The sky above Narbonne shifted restlessly between dusk and dawn, as though uncertain whether to let go of the light. Within the monastery walls, however, time felt still, arrested by ritual, by silence, by the long shadow of duty. Brother Matteo sat at a long wooden table, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the grain in the surface, worn smooth by decades of prayer and parchment. Before him, a page lay blank, ink and quill ready. But the words came slowly now, not because there were none to write, but because each one felt heavier than the last. Across the courtyard, a new cart had arrived. It was covered with a plain canvas drawn by an old, slow-moving mule. 2 men in dark robes stepped off its sides, carrying with them a soft rattle of chains, the smell of travel, and something quieter, the weight of another accusation. Matteo watched from behind a small iron-grated window. These men were not monks. They were servants of the tribunal, clerks and functionaries trained to extract order from chaos. Their faces were unreadable, the kind that had long since forgotten what it meant to flinch. He turned away. The chapel bell tolled again. A dull, hollow sound that reached every corridor like the voice of an aging ghost. The bell marked many things in the monastery. Prayer, mealtime, curfew, but most often it marked the moment an inquisitor began his work. Matteo did not rise immediately. Instead, he opened the leather-bound ledger and leafed through the delicate pages. Each one held the confessions of souls who had passed through his care. Some entries were long, others only a few lines. Some ended with absolvo te, I absolve you. Others ended with nothing at all, but all were permanent. This morning he would see a man named Guilhem. A weaver from the countryside near Béziers, Guilhem had been accused by his neighbour. The man claimed that Guilhem had refused to light a candle at Mass and had spoken blasphemies about the Virgin. These were minor charges on their surface, but in inquisitorial logic, even small cracks might lead to deeper rot. Guilhem was already waiting when Matteo entered the chamber. He was broad-shouldered, though time had softened his frame. His beard was flecked with grey, and his eyes, though bloodshot, held a quiet anger. He had not been chained, though 2 guards lingered at the doorway just the same. Matteo sat. Across from him, Guilhem did not move. I am Brother Matteo, he began, his voice as calm as ever, and I have been given the responsibility to listen. I do not presume guilt. I do not demand confession. I only ask and I record. The rest belongs to God. The man gave a bitter smile. God has been silent, he said. Matteo paused, then dipped the quill into ink. Have you ever refused the Mass? No. Have you ever denied the sanctity of the Virgin? Guilhem shrugged. I do not speak of things I do not know. Matteo looked up. But did you say she was merely a woman? I said she was born like the rest of us. If that is wrong, then strike me down. The quill scratched across parchment, slowly, precisely. Matteo had learned never to argue in these moments. Argument invited resistance. Instead, he asked again, And what of the priests? Do you accept their authority? I accept truth, Guilhem said, whatever form it takes. There was a long silence. The man's answers were not admissions, not clearly, but they bent close to heresy, brushing against it like leaves at the edge of fire. There were many who spoke this way in the south. The Cathar legacy had not died out in flame. It had retreated into the bones of daily life, hidden in lullabies and meals, and quiet glances exchanged at crossroads. Matteo leaned back slightly. He knew what was expected. He could escalate the examination, bring Guillem back tomorrow, ask again, press further. If the man continued to resist, the instruments could be fetched. The church did not consider torture a punishment, it was a form of persuasion, a way to soften the will. The body was seen as a shell, to be weakened if necessary, so that the soul might be saved. But Matteo hesitated. He remembered Esclarmonde. She had spoken in riddles, in poetry, until the day she stopped speaking at all. She was still at the monastery, now in a cell near the back. Not yet judged, not yet condemned, but fading. He looked at Guillem again. "Would you pray with me?" Matteo asked. The man blinked, confused. "Now?" "Yes." Another silence. Then slowly Guillem nodded. They bowed their heads together. It was a short prayer, not an official one, not from the books. Just a whispered invocation for mercy, for guidance, for the light to reach even the places that refused to see it. When they were done, Matteo made no further inquiry. He dismissed the man with a gesture, and Guillem was taken back to the holding room without another word exchanged. Later that evening, Matteo did not eat. He wandered the garden cloister where the rosemary and thyme grew between ancient stones. The night air was sharp, the stars blinked softly above, cold and distant. He thought of Guillem's face, the weariness in it, the defiance. And beneath that, the pain of being questioned not for what one had done, but for what one had thought. This was the burden. The tribunal had no armies, no weapons. Its power came from fear and from the knowledge that it could see inside you, that your words might twist against you, that silence itself could be a scream. Matteo looked up at the full moon, a pale, indifferent eye. He knew what the elders would say. He knew the path laid out before him, cross-examinations, documentation, eventual sentencing. It was a machinery too large for one man to halt. But tonight he allowed himself a pause, a stillness. He closed his eyes, listening to the rustling of the herbs, the slow breath of the earth, and the silence between bells. In the distance, the monastery walls whispered. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more names, more souls caught in the net. But for now, Matteo whispered a second prayer, one not written in any book. It was a prayer for doubt, and for the courage to carry it. Morning in the monastery came not with songbirds, but with bells, low, mournful and deliberate. They stirred the air like the breath of an ancient giant, moving through the stone corridors and cloisters, waking souls not with urgency, but with gravity. Brother Matteo rose slowly, the straw in his costling as he shifted beneath his habit. His joints ached more than usual, perhaps from the cold, or perhaps from something deeper, the fatigue of choices yet unnamed. Outside, the frost clung to the stones, turning the old masonry silver in the dim light. He could hear the low murmur of morning prayers, but he did not join them. Not today. Instead, he walked the northern corridor, one rarely used. It led to the archives, a place where the records of souls rested behind thick oaken doors bound in iron. The smell here was always the same: wax, dust, old parchment, and ink that never truly dried. Brother Jean was already there, hunched over a table with a magnifier lens in one hand, carefully transcribing an older document. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from age. Jean had been an inquisitor once, long ago. Now he was the keeper of memories, sifting through the past with a monk's patience and a scribe's eye. Matteo waited until Jean looked up. No words were exchanged at first. Just a knowing look, the kind that passed between men who had seen things no confession could fully cleanse. "You're early," Jean said, finally setting the lens aside. "I couldn't sleep." "No, you couldn't forget." Matteo sat beside him. The candlelight flickered gently between them. "I wonder," he said, "if memory is supposed to be a kind of penance." Jean gave a soft laugh, dry as parchment. "Memory is the only true penance we're allowed." The old man reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn volume. Its cover was cracked, the leather soft with use. "You asked once," Jean said, "about the first tribunal I ever led. Do you still wish to know?" Matteo nodded. Jean opened the book carefully, like a man lifting the lid of a coffin. It was in Albi, 30 years ago. A village priest had reported an entire family, the Delaroches, father, mother, 2 sons. He claimed they had refused communion, that they prayed in strange tongues, that they had once denied the crucifixion. And were they Cathar? Jean's eyes were distant. They were farmers, simple people. The father had studied Latin when he was younger. Sometimes he read to his children from books he didn't fully understand. The words frightened the priest, so he sent word to Toulouse. What happened? We summoned them, questioned them. The father tried to explain. The mother wept. The older boy stared at me like I had betrayed him before I even spoke. The younger one, barely 9, said nothing at all. Jean closed the book again. I ordered the father to be separated. The mother was released eventually. The boys, I don't remember what became of them. Truly? Matteo asked. Jean nodded. Truly. But you kept the record. I kept every record, Jean said. That is the burden. The soul forgets what it must to survive, but the hand writes down everything. Matteo sat in silence. The candle had burned low. I saw a man yesterday, he said. Guilhem. Strong, defiant, not guilty of heresy, not exactly, but not innocent either. I asked him to pray with me. Jean raised an eyebrow. Did he? Yes. Jean smiled faintly. Then you heard more truth than most inquisitors ever do. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt less like emptiness and more like shelter. Later that afternoon, a messenger arrived from Casson. Dusty, wind-chapped and lean, he brought with him a letter sealed in red wax of the Archbishop's office. It was brief. A name, a location, an order. A noblewoman from the outskirts of Limoux had been accused by 3 witnesses, former servants dismissed from her estate. The charges were grave: secret gatherings at night, invocations of spirit guides, denial of the sacraments, and, most damning of all, the harbouring of known heretics. Matteo read the letter twice. Then he folded it quietly and handed it to Brother Anselm, who would prepare the travel arrangements. They would leave within the week. The days that followed were filled with preparations. Horses were gathered, provisions stored, records copied and sealed. Matteo spent each evening walking the perimeter of the monastery grounds, as if saying farewell to the quiet soil that had borne witness to his first examinations. The night before his departure, he visited the cells. Most were empty now. Prisoners were not kept long. The monastery was not a jail. It was a filter. Those who confessed were given penance, absolution, and, in rare cases, exile. Those who refused were passed along to civil authorities, where punishment was more final. Only one cell remained occupied, Esclarmonde. She was seated when he entered, her back straight despite the cold. Her hair had greyed since her arrival. Her skin was thinner, but her gaze had lost none of its steadiness. I wanted to say goodbye, Matteo said. She tilted her head, curious. Am I dying? No, he said. I'm leaving. Her expression remained unchanged. They'll send another. Perhaps. A silence stretched between them. I prayed for you, she said suddenly. Matteo blinked. Not for your soul. That is between you and God, but for your sorrow. I have seen it in your eyes since the first day. I'm not supposed to feel sorrow, he said, almost to himself, and yet you do. He wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Instead he asked, why did you never confess? She looked at him as one might regard a child asking about the stars. Because I cannot lie. Matteo left without another word. That night, as he lay in his cot with the cold settling in like a second skin, he thought of Esclarmonde's voice, of Guillem's prayer, of Gion's book of names, and in the space between sleep and waking, he dreamed of flames, but not the kind that burned. These were quiet, blue-edged and mournful, the kind of fire that consumed slowly from within. The road to Limoux was long, narrow and unforgiving. It wound through steep valleys and over stony ridges, where wind whistled between the rocks like a distant chorus of sighs. Brother Matteo rode with his hood drawn low, his eyes fixed on the horizon, though his thoughts wandered far behind him, to Esclarmonde's unbroken silence, to Guilhem's quiet defiance, to the pages he had left behind in the monastery archive. The escort was small, just 3 men, 2 guards trained in the logistics of travel and the blunt work of enforcement, and 1 scribe named Brother Lucas, younger than Matteo, fresh-faced and full of nervous reverence. He clutched the tribunal's satchel close to his chest like a sacred relic, glancing frequently at Matteo as though hoping for approval or protection. They rode mostly in silence. The only sound was the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the soft jangle of the bits and reins. Occasionally, a village would pass by in the distance, a smear of thatched roofs, a trail of chimney smoke, but no one came near. The people knew what an inquisitorial entourage looked like, and they kept their doors shut. On the 5th evening, they reached Limoux. The town rested in a shallow basin by the river Aude, its streets cobbled and narrow, its buildings leaning into one another like conspirators. The air smelled of wood smoke and wine, and the church bell sounded thin and high, a brittle echo in the dusk. They were welcomed at the abbey with formality, not warmth. Father Doran, the prior, was a thin man with lips pressed into a line so tight it looked carved. He showed them to their quarters without unnecessary conversation and offered no invitation to dine. Matteo didn't mind. He had no appetite. The following morning, they received the full report. The noblewoman's name was Isabeau de Miraval. Her estate lay to the southeast, a crumbling fortress once known for its vineyards and falcons. 3 former servants, now residing within Limoux, had testified independently to her crimes. According to them, Isabeau had hosted gatherings of lights and murmurs, had turned her chapel into a place of false worship, and had refused to accept the authority of the local bishop. Most troubling of all, she had once housed a Cathar perfectus under her roof, giving him bread, water, and refuge. Matteo sat quietly as the testimonies were read aloud. His eyes stayed fixed on the stone floor. Lucas took notes. Afterward, they made their way to the estate. It was larger than Matteo expected. Ivy choked and crumbling at the edges, but still dignified. The gatehouse stood open, and 2 hounds lounged in the sun by the wall, indifferent to the arrival of the tribunal. Isabeau met them in the courtyard. She wore no jewels, no elaborate veil, only a simple gown of unbleached linen and a woolen mantle, her dark hair bound behind her neck. She did not bow. Instead, she greeted them with the kind of poise that had nothing to do with arrogance, only a practiced stillness like water just before a storm. "You are Brother Matteo," she said, not asked. He inclined his head. "And I am to answer for my soul." "You are to speak it," he replied. She led them inside without further word. The interview chamber had been prepared in advance, a former dining hall converted into a tribunal space. The windows had been shuttered. A single table sat at the centre with 2 chairs. A crucifix hung on the wall, slightly crooked. Matteo sat. Isabeau remained standing. He gestured to the other chair. She did not move. "Do you wish a performance, brother, or truth?" "I wish understanding," he said softly, "nothing more." She watched him carefully. Then slowly she sat. Matteo unfolded the first parchment. "Have you ever hosted those accused of heresy?" "I have hosted men who spoke kindly, who fed my dogs, who asked no coin for their prayers. If that is heresy, so be it." "Do you believe the sacraments of the church are necessary for salvation?" Her gaze did not falter. "I believe no ritual can purchase purity." Lucas's pen scratched rapidly behind them. "Do you deny the authority of the Bishop of Toulouse?" "I question his wealth," she said, his hunger for land, his silence in the face of famine. Matteo's hands stilled. There it was, not a direct denial, but a shaping of the truth into something just beyond the edge of acceptable. He glanced at her hands. They were folded, calm. Her face betrayed nothing. But there was a heaviness behind her eyes. Not fear, not pride, but weariness. "Lady Isabeau," he said, "this tribunal is not a court of vengeance. We do not seek to destroy, only to reconcile. If you can speak plainly, we can begin to find a way through." She leaned forward slightly. "Plainly then," she said, "I believe your church has grown too fat to see God. I believe men whisper Latin and call it holiness. I believe the Christ who walked among us would not recognize the cathedrals built in his name." Matteo closed the parchment. Silence settled in the room like dust. "You understand," he said after a pause, "that these are not idle words. They will be recorded. They will be weighed." Isabeau nodded. "And yet I have spoken them." He studied her. Every inquisitor was trained to detect evasion, misdirection, contradiction. But sometimes the truth, or what a soul believed was truth, came out like this, whole, clean, unapologetic. "Then you will remain here," Matteo said. "You are not under arrest, but the inquiry will continue. You will not leave the estate." "I have no wish to." As they exited the chamber, Lucas whispered, "She doesn't even seem afraid." Matteo gave no reply. That night he stood alone in the courtyard. The stars above were sharp and clear, scattered like white seeds across a black field. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The vineyards rustled with the breeze. He thought of what Isabeau had said about ritual, about wealth, about the silence of bishops. He thought of the records, the endless testimonies, the confessions that bent themselves into shape beneath threat of fire. And he wondered, was it the flames people feared most, or the feeling that God might not be watching after all? The estate grew quieter with each passing day. Though no formal sentence had yet been declared, the presence of the inquisitorial party was enough to still the halls and stifle conversation. The servants walked more carefully, their eyes lowered, their voices hushed. Even the hounds seemed subdued, pacing the grounds with an unease they could not name. Brother Matteo rose early, as he always did, though sleep had not come easily. His thoughts had turned restless again, circling questions that refused to settle. He had dreamed of pages burning in slow motion, not from fire, but from the weight of their own words. When he awoke, his hands were clenched, his breath shallow. He stepped into the corridor just as the first fingers of light touched the eastern windows. Dust floated in the beams, golden and silent, like old spirits disturbed. Lucas was already awake, seated cross-legged by the main entrance, reviewing his notes. The young scribe looked up as Matteo approached. "She frightens them," Lucas said softly. "The other servants." Matteo raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "They say she speaks to herself at night, walks the halls, that she doesn't sleep." Matteo considered this, then shook his head. "They're looking for signs. Fear makes everything strange." Lucas closed his notebook carefully. "Do you believe her guilty?" "I believe she is honest," Matteo said. "That is not the same." The second interview was scheduled that morning. Isabeau entered the tribunal chamber without prompting. She moved as though her steps followed an inner compass, not the demands of others. Today her dress was darker, a charcoal grey that matched the mood of the room. Matteo motioned to the chair. This time she sat without hesitation. Lucas took his place once again by the side table, quill in hand. Matteo began with gentler questions. Her lineage, her estate, her late husband's affiliations. She answered plainly. No embellishment, no attempts at defence. Just the facts, laid bare like bread on a table. Then came the harder ones. "Did you ever attend Cathar gatherings?" "I've sat beside men and women who believed the world was broken," she said, "who did not trust priests, who feared the church more than they feared hell." "That is not an answer." She turned her gaze toward him. I listened. "Is that enough to condemn me?" Matteo hesitated. "In matters of heresy," he said, "the line between listener and believer can disappear." "And what of silence?" she asked. "Is silence safer or more dangerous?" Matteo did not respond. She pressed further. "Would you rather I lie to you? Pretend to return to the fold so you can write absolvo te in your ledgers and feel that your duty is complete?" "No," Matteo said quietly. "I would rather understand what you believe." Isabeau folded her hands. "Very well," she said. "Then I believe this. God is too vast to fit into a single story. I believe the Church, in its hunger to preserve certainty, has forgotten the holiness of mystery. I believe that truth is not always loud, and that sometimes it speaks from the mouths of the broken. And I believe," she paused, voice lowering, "that those who question are not enemies but seeds." Lucas had stopped writing. Matteo sat motionless, his heart beating slow and heavy in his chest. He remembered his training, the lectures in the stone halls of Toulouse, the documents he had memorized, the words etched into the very framework of his mind. Heretics are seductive, heretics are subtle, they do not shout, they whisper. But nothing about Isabeau's words felt seductive. They felt tired, weathered, like stones worn down by centuries of rain. "Your words," Matteo said finally, "suggest a philosophy beyond orthodoxy." "I have read many books," she said, "even those forbidden." He felt a flicker of concern. "Which books?" She smiled faintly. "The Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of John, the Book of Two Principles, and others that have no titles, only torn pages passed hand to hand." Matteo made a mental note, but he did not press her. Not yet. Instead, he leaned forward slightly. "Do you believe in sin?" She nodded. "But not as you do. I believe the greatest sin is cruelty disguised as virtue." Matteo said nothing. Lucas resumed writing. The session ended without formal dismissal. Isabeau simply stood, bowed slightly, and left the chamber. Her steps echoed softly as she departed. That evening the wind picked up. It swept through the vineyards and the high windows of the estate, rattling shutters and moaning through cracks in the stone. The fire in Matteo's chamber flickered wildly. He sat alone, his back to the hearth, rereading Lucas's notes. The words felt different now, more alive. They carried the weight of confession without the comfort of redemption. Outside his door, a servant girl passed by, whispering prayers beneath her breath. He called out to her gently. She paused, startled. "What do you know of your lady?" Matteo asked. The girl hesitated, then stepped closer. She listens," she said. "That is all. She listens to everyone, the sick, the hungry, the old, even the mad." "Does she speak to spirits?" "No, only to those who no one else will hear." Matteo dismissed her with a nod. Later, he opened his own ledger. Not Lucas's notes, his private one, the one where he wrote the things that did not belong in the official record. He dipped the quill and began. Day 7. Her words linger. They are not defiant, not mocking. They are resigned. "I fear she carries a sorrow too large for judgment, and I fear the tribunal will mistake it for guilt." He paused, then added, "We have been taught to fear those who question, but perhaps in our fear we have become the ones who do not believe." He set the quill down. The wind howled once more, and this time it sounded like a woman's voice, low, steady, impossible to ignore. The next morning broke with a stillness that felt unnatural. No birds stirred in the trees. The wind that had spoken so forcefully the night before now held its breath, as if the very air around the estate had fallen into waiting. Brother Matteo dressed slowly, his fingers fumbling slightly with the belt of his habit. A part of him felt disoriented, not from fatigue, but from something subtler, as though his place within the structure of his world had shifted imperceptibly, tilted just enough to make the floor feel uneven beneath his feet. Lucas was nowhere to be seen when Matteo entered the main hall. The servants moved with an even greater caution now, their eyes cast downward, their footsteps muffled by the thick silence. The inquisitorial seal hung on the wall above the hearth, its red wax glistening faintly in the grey light. Matteo went in search of the scribe. He found him outside in the eastern courtyard, seated on a low stone bench. Lucas was bent over his notebook, not writing, but staring blankly at the last line he had recorded the day before. Matteo approached and sat beside him. For a while, neither spoke. Then quietly Lucas said, "What if she's right?" Matteo didn't pretend not to understand. About what? About the silence of God, about truth being too large for us, about cruelty masquerading as virtue. Matteo looked out over the frost-kissed garden. "That is not for us to decide." "But it is," Lucas said, more firmly than before. "Isn't it? We listen, we interpret, we transcribe, and then we decide what is true, what is dangerous, what is punishable." Matteo closed his eyes. He remembered the words of one of his old instructors, Father Sebaldus, a towering figure with a voice like thunder. The Inquisitor is not the judge, he is the lantern. But what if the lantern casts as much shadow as light? Matteo stood. "Come," he said, "we need to return to the estate library." The collection was modest, as most noble libraries were, not designed for deep theological study, but still carefully kept. The room smelled of wax and dried herbs. Dust floated like a fine mist in the sunbeams. Matteo and Lucas began to sift through the shelves. They found what they were looking for behind a false panel, a narrow stack of manuscripts, many handwritten, none bearing the seal of the church. The texts were old, some fragile, their Latin unusual, tinged with regional inflections and mystical metaphors. One of them bore the name Liber Consolationis, the Book of Consolation. Matteo opened it with care. The pages were filled with passages that echoed Cathar beliefs, dualism, the rejection of material corruption, the idea that the true God had no need for sacraments, for buildings, for fear. It was by every formal measure heretical, but it was not inflammatory. There was no call to rebellion, no hatred, only sorrow. A longing to return to something pure, uncorrupted by power. Lucas read over his shoulder. "She believes this." Matteo nodded. The question now was what to do with it. He could seize the texts, record them, report them. The presence of such volumes alone was damning. Their content was enough to confirm the accusations of heresy. Isabeau would be removed, interrogated under stricter authority, judged without further delay. Or he could leave them. Return the panel. Close the case on the grounds of insufficient proof. Label her eccentric, perhaps misled by grief or isolation. Recommend penance, a vow of silence, or retreat into a convent. But the records would remain, the whispers would persist, and Matteo would know. He closed the book. "We'll speak with her again," he said. They returned to the tribunal chamber that afternoon. Isabeau entered as before, quiet, composed. She did not seem surprised to see the manuscript laid out on the table before her. "You found it," she said simply. "You did not hide it well," Matteo replied. "I didn't intend to." Lucas remained silent, watching her carefully. Matteo sat. "Do you understand the weight of this?" "I do. And yet you kept it." "I needed something," she said, "to remind me that faith could still have warmth, that it was not all rules and punishment, that love could still exist in silence." "Why these words?" Matteo asked. "Why not turn to the scripture or the Psalms?" "They are full of war," she whispered, "of vengeance, of wrath and sacrifice. I have seen enough of those. I needed gentleness. I needed to remember that the soul is not a battlefield." Matteo studied her face. There was no defiance in it, only fatigue. "I could accuse you," he said, "formally. This is enough." "I know, but I won't," he added. Isabeau looked up sharply. "I believe you," Matteo said. "I believe your faith is real, even if it does not wear the garments I was taught to recognize." She said nothing, but her hands folded in her lap trembled slightly. "I will recommend exile," Matteo continued. "A convent in the north, far from here, a place where no one will ask questions, where no one will demand confessions. You will be silent. You will not teach. You will not write." Isabeau nodded. "That is mercy." "It is silence," Matteo said. "That is the most I can offer." The session ended. Lucas and Matteo left the chamber together, walking slowly beneath the arches of the estate. The wind had returned, not sharp now, but soft, brushing the bare branches with a gentle hush. "She will disappear," Lucas said. "Yes, and what will we write?" "The truth," Matteo replied, "but only part of it." That night he penned the official recommendation. No heresy proven beyond doubt. Writings of questionable origin discovered but not disseminated. Subject offered no resistance, displayed signs of penitence and spiritual uncertainty. Exile advised in lieu of prosecution. He signed it. Then, by candlelight, he turned to his private ledger and wrote a single line beneath the date. "Sometimes mercy is not justice, but it is the closest we dare to reach." The ink shimmered, and the page, like the night around him, waited quietly for what would come next. The road back from Limoux was longer than it had been going in. Not in miles, but in feeling. The silence between the travellers was heavier, more contemplative. Even the horses seemed to pick their way through the landscape with greater care, as if unwilling to disturb the quiet thoughts that clung to the group like fog. Brother Matteo rode at the front, his eyes fixed not on the path ahead, but on some point just beyond the present moment. He was not thinking of Isabeau, not directly. She had been escorted northward with a small escort, 2 silent guards and a letter sealed with the tribunal's mark. She was gone now, and her fate would settle into the folds of quiet obscurity. But her words remained. Her voice had become like a pebble dropped into still water, soft at first, but radiating ever outward. Matteo felt those ripples even now, days later, brushing the walls of his conviction, loosening stones he had never thought could move. Lucas rode behind him, scribbling notes as they travelled, about the terrain, the weather, the people they passed. But even his enthusiasm had dimmed. He was quieter now, more withdrawn. The Inquisitor's robe he wore had begun to feel less like a badge and more like a question mark. On the 8th evening of their journey, they stopped at a wayside monastery perched high on a narrow ridge where the wind blew cold and the bells sounded thin and fragile in the thin air. The monks here were Carthusians, silent, solemn, and withdrawn from the world. They welcomed the travellers with bowed heads and open doors, offering soup and bread without words. Matteo was grateful for the silence. That night, he sat alone in the scriptorium. The room was lit only by 2 lanterns, one hanging low above the central table, the other set by the window. Scrolls and bound codices lined the walls in orderly rows, their spines faded, their titles worn by time. He pulled an unlabelled manuscript from the shelf and opened it at random. It was a commentary on Job, a long and winding exploration of suffering and divine silence. The author had written in an old, narrow Latin, almost poetic in form. One line stood out. "It is not the absence of God that wounds the soul, but the absence of his answer." Matteo closed the book and sat for a long while, his hands resting in his lap, his breath shallow. That line repeated itself in his thoughts like a litany. When he returned to his chamber, he found Lucas still awake, seated on the floor with his knees pulled close, his notebook untouched beside him. "I couldn't sleep," the scribe said. "Nor I." Lucas looked up. "Brother, how do we know?" "Know what?" "That we are right." Matteo leaned against the door frame. The hallway behind him was dark, the only light coming from the oil lamp flickering near the bed. "We don't," Matteo said. "Not fully. We are taught to trust the canon, the councils, the hierarchy. We follow doctrine like a map, but the soul is not a landscape. It cannot be charted so easily." "Then why do we judge it?" Matteo had no answer. The next morning, they resumed their journey, but 2 days before they were due to reach Narbonne, a rider found them. He wore the colours of the Archdiocese of Carcassonne, crimson and gold, and carried a sealed letter bearing the ring of Cardinal de Villegieu, an old and powerful voice in the southern tribunal. Matteo broke the seal carefully. The letter was brief. A new accusation, this time from a village on the edge of Montségur, a place called Prats de Mollo. A priest had reported strange activities, night gatherings, candles arranged in a circle in the woods, a child claiming to see visions, a woman healing with her hands but denying the saints, a return of the old heresies. The cardinal's instructions were clear. Proceed immediately, question with firmness, document thoroughly, the region remains unstable and your discretion is expected. Matteo read the letter twice, then folded it slowly. He handed it to Lucas, without a word. The younger man read it, his face pale. "They're sending us into Car territory," Lucas said. "Yes." "I thought it was cleansed. Years ago." Matteo looked to the hills in the distance. "It was burned," he said, "but that does not mean it was cleansed." That night, as they camped by a stream beneath the rustling canopy of ash and fir, Matteo wrote in his private ledger, "The path ahead grows darker, not because it holds more danger, but because I now see how little light I carry. We call ourselves seekers of truth, but perhaps we are merely chasers of certainty." He paused, then added, "I have begun to wonder if faith that fears questions is faith at all." The wind moved gently across the water. In the distance, the mountains of Montségur loomed, tall, grey and silent. Their peaks were dusted with early snow. Their roots ran deep into the land, and deeper still into the stories buried beneath it. Matteo closed his eyes. He could feel the old world stirring, the ghosts of a fire that had never quite gone out. The village of Prats de Mollo greeted them with eyes, not words. Windows shuttered quietly as the inquisitorial riders approached. Doors closed with the hush of long-trained caution, and children were pulled gently but firmly behind skirts and cloaks. The mountains above stood watchful and unmoved, their white crowns hidden in mist, their flanks wrapped in the colours of late autumn, gold, rust, and the dying green of cold-bitten leaves. Brother Matteo dismounted slowly at the edge of the village square, where a small fountain trickled in the silence. Lucas followed, his boots crunching over frost-stiff earth. The guards remained mounted, their hands resting near the hilts of their swords, though there was no crowd, no commotion, only stillness. A priest emerged from the chapel. He was a short, narrow-shouldered man, his robe patched at the elbows, his eyes red from long hours of worry. He approached with a blend of nervous reverence and something else, desperation perhaps, or guilt. "Father Pierre," he introduced himself, bowing low. "I sent the letter. Praise be to God that you have come." Matteo nodded. "We received your report. You will tell us everything." The chapel was small, built from local stone, its altar plain, its candles low. Dust hovered in the beams of afternoon light like ash. They sat together in a side chamber, where the air was musty and close. "It began 6 weeks ago," Father Pierre said. "Strange gatherings in the woods to the south. The villagers deny it, but I've seen the lights myself, pale and flickering like oil on water. Not torches, something colder. And there's the girl." Matteo frowned. "Girl?" "Her name is Bruna. She's 8, or maybe 9. Her mother died in childbirth. She was raised by an old healer named Tavia. No husband, no affiliation, no reverence. Tavia lives near the river, past the fields. The child, she speaks of visions, sees things, and the people," he hesitated, "they believe her." Lucas had begun taking notes already, his script fast but careful. "They say Bruna knows when a cow will sicken, when frost will come, that she can soothe fevers with a touch. But she doesn't pray, not to Christ, not to the saints. When asked who she speaks to, she only says, 'The light knows me.'" Matteo remained still. "And this Tavia?" he asked. Pierre grimaced. "Old, quiet, keeps to herself, but she walks the woods at night, and the girl follows her." The rest of the day was spent gathering names. They moved through the village slowly, speaking to the people one by one. Most were reluctant, answering only in fragments. Some professed ignorance. Others muttered of odd dreams, of strange smells on the wind, of hearing whispers on moonless nights. Always the name returned, Tavia, and the child, Bruna. By evening, the inquisitorial party had made arrangements to stay in the priest's small rectory. Matteo sat alone after supper, reviewing the interviews, eyes heavy with the weight of suggestion. Herbs found burning in fields, stones arranged in circles, dreams of voices in foreign tongues, a cow that rose from its sickbed without explanation, a boy who claimed his brother was cured after Bruna sang to him in a language no one could name. Lucas entered quietly, holding a folded scrap of parchment. "I went to the far end of the village," he said. "There's a woman named Sabette. She's deaf in one ear and half blind, but she told me something." Matteo raised an eyebrow. "She said she saw Bruna kneel by the old shrine near the river, but not like a child at play. She said it looked like worship." Matteo took the parchment. A rough map had been drawn, showing the edge of the forest and the path to the river, winding between gnarled trees. "I'll go in the morning," he said. Lucas hesitated. "Should we not call her here?" "She won't come," Matteo replied. "Not if the people believe in her, and not if she's seen the seal on our satchel." That night, the air in the village was thick with frost. Matteo lay awake on the narrow cot, staring at the wooden beams above him. His thoughts refused to settle, not on Bruna, not on the accusations, but on something else, the tone of the villagers' silence. It was not the fear he knew, not the trembling submission he had seen in other places. This silence had roots. It was woven into the way they passed each other on the path, into how they poured water and gathered bread. It was a silence that had learned how to survive, and that, more than anything, disturbed him. He rose before dawn. The world was still dark, the stars brittle in the sky. Lucas stirred, but did not wake as Matteo gathered his cloak, his satchel, and the leather-bound ledger. The map in his hand, he slipped through the chapel gate and began the walk southward. The forest welcomed him not with menace, but with a strange, fragile peace. The leaves whispered beneath his boots. The trees stood like old sentinels. Somewhere nearby, a stream sang a soft, steady tune. After half an hour, he saw smoke, thin, silvery, rising in slow spirals from a moss-covered chimney. The cottage was crooked, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of years. Herbs hung in bundles from the eaves. A woven basket sat by the door, filled with root vegetables and dried flowers. Tavia stepped out before he could knock. She was older than he expected, her hair silver, her eyes pale as milk, but her posture was upright and her expression calm. "You've come," she said, not surprised, not afraid. "Yes, you won't find what you're looking for." Matteo met her gaze. "I haven't yet said what I'm looking for." "You're looking for fire," she replied. "But there is none here." He studied her carefully. "And the girl? She is inside, sleeping. She does not belong to you." "I must speak with her." Tavia stepped aside. "Then enter, but come as a man, not as a mask." Matteo hesitated, then passed through the threshold. The air inside was warm, perfumed with dried mint and smoke. A small fire crackled in the hearth. Books lined the shelves, not many, but old ones, with titles rubbed away. Bruna lay curled on a straw mattress in the corner, her breathing slow and even. "She doesn't wake easily," Tavia said. "She dreams too deeply." Matteo stepped closer. The girl's face was thin, her eyelids fluttering. One hand rested over her heart, the other against her cheek. She looked no different than any child. But then she opened her eyes, and for a moment, just a breath, Matteo saw something vast and wordless pass through them. Not madness, not trickery, but a kind of seeing that was deeper than knowledge. She blinked slowly and smiled. "You're the one who asks too much," she whispered. Matteo froze. The girl reached out and touched his hand. "It's all right," she said. "You don't have to understand." And then she closed her eyes again, her breath softening, returning to the rhythm of dreams. Tavia stood in the doorway, watching. "You cannot burn what does not fear fire," she said. Matteo said nothing. Outside, the wind began to rise, rustling the dry leaves in long, slow waves. Matteo did not return to the village until the sun had risen fully above the tree line. The morning light filtered through the canopy like sifted gold, catching in the dew and illuminating the path ahead with a soft clarity. Yet clarity was the one thing Matteo lacked as he walked in silence, the memory of Bruna's voice echoing gently in the recesses of his mind. "You're the one who asks too much." The words had not been spoken with fear nor challenge. There had been no scorn in her tone, only quiet knowledge, as if she had not learned something about him, but had always known it, and that disturbed Matteo more than any confession ever had. When he arrived back in Prats de Mollo, the square was just beginning to stir. The blacksmith was tending his forge, smoke rising from the chimney like a muted herald. A few women carried baskets to and from the communal oven, heads low, eyes watchful. No one approached. No one asked where he had gone. Lucas was waiting by the chapel steps, his cloak drawn tightly around his shoulders. "You were gone long," the scribe said. "I found her." Lucas hesitated. "And? She's not what I expected." "That's not an answer." Matteo gave a tired smile. "No, it isn't." They stepped inside the chapel together. Father Pierre was preparing the altar for morning mass, arranging candles with trembling hands. He looked up as they entered, his eyes rimmed with red. "You've seen the girl?" he asked. "I have." "Then you understand," Pierre said. "You see it now. You see it now, the signs, the way she speaks. That woman, Tavia, she's poisoning the child's soul." Matteo remained silent. "I've heard the villagers," Pierre continued, voice rising slightly. "They speak of her in reverence. They follow her with their eyes. They wait for her to speak before they act. She is becoming something else, something dangerous." Lucas stepped forward. "And yet she is only a child." Father Pierre rounded on him. "So was Abel before he bled in the field. Youth does not shield truth or damnation." Matteo raised a hand. "I will return this evening," he said. "I will speak with them both again, and then I will decide what must be written." Pierre nodded, but the tension in his shoulders did not ease. Later that afternoon, Matteo sat alone in the sacristy, his journal open but blank before him. He dipped his quill into ink, hesitated, and then began. "There is a difference between belief and influence. One is private, the quiet tether between a soul and its meaning. The other is wildfire. It moves between bodies, it ignites." He paused. "This child, she is no heretic, not by canon, not by creed, but she speaks in riddles that move hearts, and the church fears what moves outside of its touch." As the sun fell toward the horizon, Matteo returned once more to the forest. This time, the door of Tavia's cottage was open before he arrived. Bruna was seated outside on a low stool, her bare feet in the cold grass, a small braid woven into the side of her hair. She looked up as he approached, not startled, simply aware. "I thought you might come again," she said. "You know why I'm here." "Yes." He sat beside her. For a time they listened to the birds nesting in the branches, the rustle of wind through dying leaves. "Do you understand what people say about you?" Matteo asked. Bruna nodded. "They think you see things. I do. Do you understand what that means? It means they want to know what I see," she said, "until they don't." "And what do you see in me?" Bruna looked at him. Her eyes did not waver. "I see a man who once believed in something bigger than himself," she said. "But now he only believes in what he can name." Matteo stared at her. "That's not an accusation," she added softly. "It's just a shape you wear." Tavia appeared from within the cottage, her hands dusted with flour. She regarded Matteo with the same calm patience as before. "You've seen enough," she said. "Now you must choose." Matteo nodded. He stood. Bruna did not rise, but she looked up at him one last time. "I won't be here long," she said. "What do you mean?" "I never stay. Places change, people change. Then it's time to move again." Matteo frowned. "Who tells you this?" "No one," she whispered, "but I always know." The walk back was slow. Dusk clung to the branches, deepening the shadows, painting the sky in bruises and fire. The village lights flickered ahead like stars fallen to earth. Matteo felt each step press against the weight of something larger than judgment. When he returned to the chapel, Lucas met him again. "Well?" the scribe asked. Matteo placed his hand gently on the younger man's shoulder. "We're leaving in the morning." "And the report?" "I'll write it tonight." That night, by the light of a single taper, Matteo composed the official record. Inquiry conducted in the village of De Mollo. Allegations of heretical activity unconfirmed. The child in question demonstrates unusual intuition and local superstition, but no evidence of formal apostasy or doctrinal violation. Recommend no further action. Region stable. Close the case. He signed it. Then, in his private ledger, he wrote more slowly. What is faith, if not the ability to live with mystery? What is heresy, if not the refusal to be still inside another man's answers? He stopped, then added, I do not know what Bruna is, but she is not afraid, and in that, perhaps she is the holiest of us all. They returned to Narbonne beneath skies as grey as old vellum, heavy with unfallen rain. The monastery came into view through the early mist, its towers rising like solemn watchmen, its bells silent for the hour. Matteo's horse moved slowly now, its gait wearied by weeks of travel and the burden of silence. Lucas rode beside him, his eyes distant, his satchel heavier than when they'd left. As they passed through the outer gate, a young novice greeted them with a stiff nod and a scroll pressed urgently into Matteo's hand. A letter, the boy said, from Toulouse, sealed by the bishop himself. It arrived 3 days ago. Matteo thanked him, but did not break the seal immediately. Instead, he dismounted, his legs sore and reluctant, and followed the familiar path through the cloister, past the cracked statue of Saint Dominic, past the lavender beds gone dry with autumn's chill, and into the chamber that had once felt like home. Only once the door had closed behind him did he open the scroll. The bishop's words, as always, both cold and florid. The tribunal had reviewed several of his past recommendations. His casework had raised concerns, particularly his judgment in Limoux and Prats de Mollo. There were whispers, the bishop noted, that his investigations had grown lenient, that his reports displayed a tone more suited to a confessor than an inquisitor. He was ordered to remain in Narbonne. No further travels, no new inquiries. He was to assist in document review, interrogation, transcription, and theological documentation until further notice. The bishop expressed confidence that Matteo would use this opportunity to reflect on the sacred responsibility entrusted to him. Matteo folded the letter once, twice, then laid it gently on the table beside the extinguished candle. The room around him was exactly as he had left it. The same modest cot, the same worn crucifix above the door, the same ink-stained desk where he had once practiced his Latin as a young novitiate. And yet the walls now felt narrower, the air thicker. Exile, he thought, did not always come with bars. A soft knock came later that evening. Lucas entered, carrying a tray of food and a curious look. They've grounded us, he said. Yes! Are we being punished? Matteo smiled faintly. No more than usual. Lucas set the tray down. I overheard 2 monks speaking. They said you let a heretic escape. She wasn't a heretic. Lucas sat across from him. You're not the same man who left this monastery. No, Matteo agreed. And that may be the reason they've locked the doors behind me. The weeks that followed passed like molasses. Each day was a repetition of the last. Long hours bent over ancient texts, recopying confessions from cases decades old, translating decrees from papal Latin into the local dialect, and reviewing transcripts from inquisitions conducted in places he would never see. Names filled the margins, so many names, men and women and children, most of whom he would never meet, many of whom had never spoken more than a few words before judgment was sealed. He read their fates with the detachment of a man forced to wear another's hands. Occasionally he would find his own handwriting in the margins of older records. Notes written during his early years, sharp, confident, full of certainty. He did not recognize that voice anymore. One evening, deep in the archives, Matteo came across a bundle of documents bound in crimson thread. They were from Montaigu, a village once considered a haven of Cathar belief. He had studied it as a student, fascinated by its dense web of confessions. One name in particular caught his eye, Raymonde Belot. He remembered her, a shepherd's daughter. She had confessed not only to listening to Cathar sermons, but to secretly reciting them herself in the woods. Her words had been calm, sincere, unapologetic. He read her transcript again now, years later. What struck him most was not her defiance, but her grace. Her language was soft, poetic. She spoke of the soul as a bird trapped in a cage of flesh, of heaven as a place too quiet for anger. She had been burned, the record said so plainly. In fide deficit, sed corde remansit tranquilla. She failed in faith, but her heart remained calm. Matteo closed the bundle and leaned back, staring at the ceiling of the archive. A single moth drifted near the lantern light, its wings dusted with time. He watched it circle, again and again, until it finally settled on the edge of the table, not burned, not trapped, only still. That night he returned to his private ledger. There are truths too soft to be shouted, and souls too fragile to be judged by fire. I used to think my work was to protect the church from error, but now I wonder if it was to protect truth from certainty. Certainty does not listen, it does not pause, it does not forgive, it only declares. He laid down his quill. Outside, the bells tolled for Compline, the final prayer of the day. Matteo rose, folded his hands, and whispered the liturgy from memory, not as a ritual, not as a habit, but as a plea to a silence that had perhaps been listening all along. In pace, in idipsum dormium et requiescam, in peace I will lie down and sleep and take my rest. But sleep did not come easily, not anymore. Winter came quietly to Narbonne. The first frost arrived not with fanfare, but as a soft silvering of the monastery's cloister stones, a breath of cold that crept under doors and pressed gently against the edges of parchment. The fig trees curled inward. The lavender bushes bowed under their own weight. Even the bell rope grew stiff with damp. Brother Matteo moved through these days like a shadow in his own life. He rose early, as always, and performed the duties assigned to him. He translated papal bulls, catalogued regional testimonies, and reviewed case reports forwarded from smaller monastic courts. He answered to no tribunal, presided over no inquiry. His pen, not his voice, was now his tool. He had become, quietly, gradually, invisible. Lucas remained close, though even his buoyant curiosity had dimmed. The young scribe no longer asked questions with the same urgency. He spent long hours in the library, muttering phrases to himself, practicing his Latin not for fluency but for ritual, as if to remind himself that meaning still resided somewhere behind the ink. But it was Matteo who had changed more profoundly. He had begun to see the weight of each word, the subtle violence of them. He understood now that a phrase like probas semiplena, partial proof, could mean the difference between freedom and fire, that a line such as suspectus in fide, suspected in faith, could brand a man for life. And he saw how easily these judgments were handed down, not by tyrants, not by monsters, but by men who thought they were serving something greater. He remembered their faces, not only the accused, Esclarmonde, Guilhem, Isabeau, Tavia, Bruna, but his own colleagues. Fathers and brothers who had spoken with gentleness even as they signed death into parchment. Men who recited the creed with clear eyes and unwavering hands while the oil boiled and the torches hissed. He began to wake from dreams he didn't remember having, dreams where words turned to ash in his mouth, or where he stood before a congregation and could no longer speak the name of Christ without weeping. One morning in late December, Matteo was summoned to the abbot's chamber. Abbot Aurelian was a pale man with sparse white hair and long, elegant fingers. He was not unkind, but neither was he indulgent. He had the air of a man who lived more in rules than in rooms. Brother Matteo, the abbot began, gesturing for him to sit. You have served faithfully during your reassignment. Matteo said nothing. Your work is precise, and yet... The abbot steepled his fingers. There are concerns. Some of your notations have come to the attention of the tribunal in Toulouse. They speak of personal reflections. Matteo nodded. Yes. You understand these documents are not private. I do now. The abbot studied him. There was a time, Matteo said, when I believed that to speak honestly was to serve truth. I see now that truth has boundaries. No, Aurelian replied calmly. It has walls to protect it. And what of the truth that grows outside those walls? The abbot smiled faintly. Then it is not our truth. Matteo looked away. You will remain under observation, Aurelian continued. Your duties will be narrowed, your writings reviewed. This is not punishment, it is discipline, a chance to realign your heart. Matteo inclined his head in compliance, but his heart did not move. That evening, in the quiet of his chamber, Matteo opened his private ledger one last time. He stared at the blank page for a long while. Then, with deliberate slowness, he wrote, I have not lost my faith, but I have lost the shape of it. The church taught me to name heresy, but not to name wonder. It gave me tools to root out rebellion, but none to honour silence. It trained my mind to question others, never myself. But now, doubt has become my devotion, and mercy my heresy. He closed the book. The next day he rose before matins and walked through the sleeping monastery, his steps light, his breath blooming in the cold air. He passed the old scriptorium, the cloister garden, the chapel where he had once prayed for strength without knowing what strength truly was. He reached the archive. With careful hands he pulled 3 records from the shelves. Esclarmonde, Isabeau, Bruna. He carried them to the desk, opened them and added a single note to each. Revisited. Evidence inconclusive. Recommend preservation for further review. No lies, only enough ambiguity to buy time. Perhaps that time would be wasted. Or perhaps it would be the only mercy he could now offer. As dawn broke through the stained glass above the chapel, painting the walls in soft hues of violet and gold, Matteo knelt. Not in penance, not in fear, but in quiet defiance of a world that had forgotten what it meant to kneel without begging. He did not pray, he listened. January settled over Narbonne like a shroud of old linen, dull, heavy and unyielding. The days were short now, the sun barely cresting the hills before it sank again into shadow. In the monastery fires burned low, meals were fewer, and silence grew even thicker in the stone corridors, as though the cold had frozen the voices in men's throats. Brother Matteo's duties had been reduced further still. He was no longer trusted with record-keeping in the tribunal's archives. Instead, he was tasked with the mundane, cleaning the reliquary, oiling the hinges of the vestry doors, repairing torn hymnals. It was penance disguised as duty, a slow bleeding of status designed to remind him who held authority over truth. But he did not resist. There was something almost sacred in the rhythm of simplicity, in the way candle wicks curled and blackened under careful trimming, in the hushed reverence of polishing a chalice no one would use until Easter. His hands, once trained to interrogate, now served in silence. Lucas noticed. The young scribe remained by Matteo's side, though his work remained untouched. His notebook stayed closed more often now. He had begun to ask fewer questions, but when he did, they carried more weight. "Why don't you fight it?" he asked one morning, as they sat together in the refectory, alone and unspoken. Matteo sipped the thin broth without looking up. "Because I'm no longer sure where the battle begins or ends. They're trying to erase your voice." Matteo finally met his gaze. "Then let them. I've spoken enough." Lucas frowned, as if the answer hurt more than he'd expected. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters like a lost choir. That night, Matteo was summoned again. Not by Abbot Aurelian, but by a visitor. He entered the abbey's reception chamber to find a tall man in travel-worn garments, his cloak marked with the sigil of the Tribunal of Toulouse, the stylized cross and open book. His face was narrow, his beard meticulously trimmed, his eyes sharp with the glint of ambition polished by discipline. "Brother Matteo," he said with the kind of smile that did not reach the eyes. "My name is Father Corvinus. I've been asked to review several inquiries from this region. I understand you've had some difficulties." Matteo bowed politely. "I serve where I am placed." "Good," Corvinus said, setting down a scroll case with deliberate care. "Because your presence is required." Matteo stilled. "The bishop believes your previous attachments to certain cases may be clouding your discernment. He has assigned me to reopen 3 of them." Corvinus opened the case, withdrew a small sheaf of parchments and spread them across the table like playing cards. "These. Esclarmonde, Isabeau, Bruna." "I'm to verify the integrity of your conclusions," Corvinus said, his voice soft, almost warm. "You will assist me, review the testimonies, clarify inconsistencies, help ensure no threads have been missed." Matteo said nothing. Corvinus smiled again. "You seem troubled." "I'm remembering," Matteo said, "what it feels like to carry a torch into a place that only ever needed a candle." Corvinus chuckled. "Poetic, but misplaced. The truth cannot fear examination." "No," Matteo replied, "but those who carry it sometimes do." They began the work the following morning. Corvinus treated it like an exhumation, peeling back each layer of testimony, noting discrepancies, mapping patterns of speech and behaviour. He moved efficiently, with the detachment of a man dissecting something already presumed dead. Matteo, for the most part, watched. When prompted, he answered. He clarified names, dates, weather, the spacing of pauses in the accused's phrasing. He remembered everything. He always had. But the knowledge now felt like a blade turned inward. By the 3rd day, Corvinus had built his case. He summoned Abbot Aurelian and Lucas, and together they stood in the tribunal chamber, its air heavy with smoke and candle wax. These 3 cases, Corvinus announced, demonstrate a pattern of evasive rhetoric, symbolic language, and rejection of orthodoxy masked as personal spirituality. Brother Matteo, perhaps unintentionally, has overlooked key signs of heretical thought. Matteo said nothing. Corvinus turned to him. You recommended leniency. You failed to report contraband texts. You allowed the continued influence of potentially heretical individuals. Matteo lifted his head. Because I found no heresy. Corvinus's lips curled into a smile that was too smooth. Then you failed to look. The silence that followed was not empty. It was pregnant with meaning, with accusation, with implication, with the cold certainty that comes before a sentence. Abbot Aurelian spoke at last. Brother Matteo, he said quietly, you are to be confined to the monastery grounds. You will no longer participate in theological duties. A formal inquest will be held. Until then, you are to remain in silent reflection. Matteo bowed his head. He did not argue. Lucas followed him out, his face pale with something shame and fury. They're turning you into the heretic, he whispered. They're rewriting your story. I have no story, Matteo said. Only memory. But what if they burn it? Matteo looked toward the chapel, then let the fire come. That night, in his chamber, Matteo removed the ledger from beneath his cot. He opened it for what he believed might be the final time. The fire does not frighten me. I've seen worse. I've seen men lose their names long before the flames touched their skin. I've seen truth rot beneath obedience. I've seen the sacred turned into ash by hands too clean to hold anything real. If they take this from me, this voice, this ledger, let it be known that it was never mine to keep. It belonged to those whose words were never written, to those whose silences I misunderstood. He signed it, not with his title, but only Matteo. And then he closed the book, wrapped it in linen and tucked it into the hollow behind the loose stone in his wall, not to preserve himself, but to preserve the memory of what mercy had once looked like. The days that followed were unmarked by sound. Brother Matteo's silence was not the ordered, sacred stillness of monastic routine. It was deeper, stranger, more personal, a silence that reached down into the marrow, pulling tight every thought that had once flowed freely. He spoke to no one, not to Lucas, not to the brothers, not even to the wind that crept in under the old shutters. The monastery, sensing the shift, adjusted its posture. Where once his presence had been greeted with polite nods and respectful deference, now it was met with sidelong glances, quiet turns of shoulders, and occasionally murmurs that died on approach. Even those who had once studied under him, novices who had listened intently to his lessons on doctrine and rhetoric, now passed him in the cloister with faces carefully blank. He became a shadow of his own shape. Lucas remained nearby but distant, watching like a man circling a wounded animal in the dark. Each day he brought Matteo food, sometimes a folded piece of parchment, a quote from scripture, a note of encouragement. But the older man rarely responded. He would nod, or place a hand gently on the boy's shoulder, then return to his walking or his silence. In truth, Matteo was not waiting for absolution. He was waiting for understanding. But none came, until the morning of the inquiry. The bell tolled thrice. Not for prayer, not for mass, but for processus, the ritual of judgment. The stone hall was cold when Matteo entered, his sandals brushing the floor like dry leaves. The tribunal table had been moved into the chapel nave itself, beneath the watchful eye of the crucifix that hung there, arms outstretched in wood and suffering. Father Corvinus sat at the centre, his robes stiff and immaculate. Abbot Aurelian was beside him, flanked by two scribes. A few monks stood at the periphery, eyes lowered, lips thin. Lucas stood at the back, his face unreadable. Matteo took his place without hesitation. "This is not a trial," Corvinus began, his voice clear and polished. "It is an inquiry into a brother's discernment, or its absence. We do not question your devotion, Brother Matteo, only the choices you have made, the leniencies, the omissions, the curious theology present in your private writings." He paused. "Do you deny authoring the annotations we found in your hand? Do you deny recommending mercy over certainty in matters of heresy?" Matteo raised his eyes. "No." "Do you retract those recommendations now?" "No." A murmur stirred at the edge of the chamber. Corvinus narrowed his gaze. "Then we must ask, brother, do you still believe in the authority of the Church? Do you still believe in the righteousness of its tribunals?" Matteo was still. Then he said, "I believe in the church. I no longer believe it is incapable of error." "Then you contradict its very foundation." "I contradict nothing," Matteo replied. "I confess only that I have seen things the church was not ready to see. Such as..." He looked toward the window, where pale light broke against the dust like mist in glass. "I've seen a woman refuse to lie to save her life. I've seen a child speak with a gentleness greater than our laws. I've seen faith that bloomed in silence, not speech, in questions, not answers, in mercy, not obedience." Corvinus's hands tensed. "These are the words of a mystic," he said, "of one untethered from doctrine." Matteo looked at him. "These are the words of a man who has walked with fire and learned that it does not purify, it consumes." There was a long silence. Then Aurelian spoke, more softly. "Brother, where does your loyalty lie?" Matteo closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he answered, "With the truth, even when it trembles." The inquiry ended without ceremony. There was no verdict, not that day. Matteo was led gently from the chamber, not in chains, but in a quiet corridor of glances and lowered heads. His cell was locked, not with keys, but with silence. The kind that drapes over a man like cloth pulled over a mirror. Lucas came to him the next evening. He brought no bread, no notes, only a folded bundle beneath his cloak. When he unwrapped it, Matteo recognized it immediately. His ledger. Lucas held it out. "They didn't find it. I did. I read it." Matteo didn't speak. "I don't know what to do," Lucas whispered. "I want to believe everything you wrote, but it terrifies me." "It should," Matteo said softly. "Then what is the point of it?" "The point," Matteo replied, "is not to feel safe. It is to feel awake." Lucas knelt. For a moment neither spoke. Only the sound of the wind outside, brushing through the branches, steady and eternal. Then Matteo placed a hand on the boy's head, the way a father might, not to bless but to forgive. "I don't know if I will be excommunicated," he said, "or silenced, or simply forgotten. But if they take me, take the ledger. Hide it, not for me, for the questions it dares to ask." Lucas nodded, eyes wet. "Promise me," Matteo said. "I promise." That night, Matteo did not sleep. He sat by the narrow slit of window, watching the stars rise one by one, each like a breath held in the cold dark of the world. He didn't know if dawn would bring chains, or flames, or silence, but he no longer feared any of them, because at last his soul no longer trembled with the weight of borrowed certainty. It breathed, quietly, deeply, as if it had finally remembered what it was to be alive. The dawn came like a sigh through the stone. No horns, no bells, only the slow light spreading across the floor of Brother Matteo's cell, cold and pale, touching the edge of his cot, then the corner of his robe, then finally the side of his face. He opened his eyes and felt neither dread nor relief. There had been no summons during the night, no messenger bearing chains, no order for public penance. He remained untouched, at least outwardly, yet he sensed the change, not dramatic, but irrevocable. Like a thread pulled from a tapestry, too thin for others to notice, but enough to make the whole cloth loosen. A quiet punishment. The kind that does not name itself. He dressed slowly, with the careful attention of a man who knew each gesture might soon become ritual. Not a preparation for death, no, but for a different kind of departure. When he stepped out into the corridor, the monastery was already stirring. The morning chants echoed faintly from the chapel, low, ancient syllables stretching across the cold air like a veil. A few brothers passed him on their way to the cloister walk, eyes flicking toward him and then away again. Matteo no longer expected words. He no longer waited for them. He made his way to the garden instead. The winter air was sharp but clean. The herbs had long since withered, their stalks brittle beneath the snow. Only the rosemary remained green, stubborn and fragrant even in the frost. Matteo knelt beside it, fingers brushing the stems. The scent clung to him, dry, earthy, memory-laced. He remembered his first day in the monastery, the same garden, the same plant. He had been 16, eager, rigid with purpose. Back then he believed holiness could be sharpened like a blade. That truth was a single note, ringing clearly if struck with enough force. But truth had not rung, it had wept. Behind him, quiet footsteps approached. He turned and saw Lucas, wrapped in his winter cloak, holding a small linen parcel in both hands. "They're watching me now," the boy said. "I know." Lucas sat beside him on the garden wall, shoulders hunched. His face was leaner than before. The candlelight in his eyes had dimmed, but something else now flickered there. Not rebellion, but resolve. "I copied the ledger," he whispered. "Twice." Matteo's brow rose. "One copy I've hidden. The other I left in the chapel library, tucked behind a broken hymnal." "You took a risk." Lucas looked at him. "So did you." Matteo gave a faint smile. "And what will you do now?" "I don't know." Lucas turned his gaze to the sky. "Maybe leave. Maybe stay until I'm forced to leave. Maybe write something of my own." "You should," Matteo said. "But write gently. The world already has enough fire." They sat in silence as the morning brightened, soft gold threading through the clouds, brushing the chapel's roof in fading light. Somewhere in the distance the bells rang tertiae, the hour of labour. But Matteo did not rise, nor did Lucas. "I've been thinking," Lucas said, voice quieter now, "all these years, all these rituals and rules, we've been told that faith is obedience, that salvation is submission, but what if it isn't? What if God listens better to those who whisper their doubts than to those who shout their certainty?" Matteo closed his eyes. "That," he murmured, "is a question worth burning for." They stayed in the garden until the sun crested high, until the frost melted from the stone, until the monastery resumed its rhythm around them. Chants, bells, footsteps echoing across worn marble floors. But the garden remained still outside the clockwork. It became a sanctuary within a sanctuary. That evening, Matteo received another letter, slipped under his door, unsigned, sealed with a plain wax drop, no mark, no symbol, only a single sheet of parchment and a brief message written in a steady, careful hand. "There are whispers in Toulouse. Some are beginning to read, others beginning to question. You are not alone. Be still." Wait, Matteo read the words twice. Then, without folding the parchment, he pressed it to his chest and closed his eyes. It was not absolution. Not yet, but it was a crack in the wall. Small, unseen by most, but there. That night, he did not write in his ledger. Instead, he sat by the window once more, and this time he prayed. But his prayer had no words. It was a quiet thing, a kind of leaning, a surrender, not to doctrine, not to dogma, but to the gentle, aching possibility that grace did not come from fire, but from endurance, from continuing, from remembering, from remaining open even after the doors had closed. Spring arrived in Narbonne slowly, like a child pressing tentative steps onto cold earth. The almond trees were the first to stir, their bare branches blooming with soft white flowers that fluttered down with every gust of wind, like fragile secrets loosed from the sky. The stones of the monastery, so long gripped by frost, warmed beneath a gentler sun. Birds returned to the cloister arches, building nests in the nooks carved centuries ago by hands long buried. Brother Matteo watched it all unfold, not as a man freed, but as one who had learned to live within the walls of his own silence. The inquiry had ended, but no verdict had been issued. No sentence passed, no absolution granted. His confinement was never lifted officially, but it was no longer enforced. The door to his cell was no longer locked. He was neither welcomed nor condemned, simply allowed. He remained within the grounds by choice more than rule. His world had narrowed, but not diminished. His purpose had changed. Each day he rose before the bell, before the chanting, before the daily rhythm resumed its procession. He would walk the garden paths, tend the stubborn rosemary, speak softly to the dying vines, and whisper verses to the sparrows. Words that were not liturgy, not doctrine, only memory. Lucas left in early April. He did not announce his departure. No ceremony, no farewell. Matteo found his cell empty one morning, the cot neatly made, the writing desk cleared, save for a single scrap of parchment. "I go not in defiance, but in search. I carry what I must, I carry you." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Matteo folded the note, placed it inside the cover of a worn psalter, and tucked the book beneath his mattress. The days passed. He was rarely spoken to, but sometimes watched. Young monks, curious and cautious, would glance his way during meals, and perhaps recognizing in him something that was both warning and invitation. He did not teach, yet he was listened to. His silence had become its own kind of witness. Then one morning a letter arrived, carried not by a novice but by a traveller in civilian clothes, a man with ink-stained fingers and parchment tied at his hip. The messenger did not speak as he handed Matteo the small leather pouch, sealed not with wax but with thread. Inside were pages, familiar words, his words. copied carefully, rewritten in a steadier hand, distributed. He read them slowly and felt the strange ache of recognition, not of authorship, but of survival. People were reading. Somewhere beyond Narbonne, beyond the walls, beyond the stone breath of the monastery, the ledger lived. Its pages, copied, hidden, passed hand to hand, had become something else. Not protest, not rebellion, but reminder. A reminder that mercy had a voice. He returned to the garden that evening, where the first crocuses were breaking through the thawed earth, trembling under their own softness. He knelt and pressed his palm into the soil. "Do you see?" he whispered. "You bloom without command." The wind rustled the trees. He thought of Esclarmonde, her quiet gaze and unbending will, of Guillem's defiance, of Isabeau and her tired clarity, of Tavia's silence, of Bruna's vision. He thought of the unnamed, the forgotten, the disappeared. He thought of himself, not as their judge, not even as their chronicler, but as their witness. That night, for the first time in weeks, he opened a blank page in his new ledger, and he wrote, "There are truths so soft, the world forgets how to hold them, and souls so bruised, they slip through the fingers of doctrine like water. I was taught to name such things dangerous, now I name them holy. The church will survive me, but so will these words. They are no longer mine. They belong to the ones who still believe that faith can tremble and not be lost." He signed it, then closed the book. In the stillness of the room, the candle flickered, and in that wavering light, Brother Matteo did not look like a man defeated. He looked like a man who had remembered something ancient, something older than the church, older than fire, something that could not be punished, nor silenced, nor burned.